Hello and welcome to Heroic Media. I'm Michelle Bauman.
And I'm Patrick Cordova. This week on Heroic Media, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo mandates insurance companies to cover gender reassignment surgeries and hormone therapies.
Planned Parenthood takes over sex education at a public high school in California, and parents are outraged.
The founder of a post-abortive healing ministry warns the stakes are high with the use of chemical contraception.
Stay tuned for all these stories and more here on Heroic Media.
So here at Heroic Media, we explore news headlines that deal with very foundational moral issues relating to family, marriage, and life.
Exactly, and those issues often involve abortion, euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, human cloning, and homosexual marriage.
Right. So,
Patrick, what's our first story for today?
All right, in our first story, Governor Cuomo warns insurance companies that they won't be able to deny insurance, specifically gender reassignment, if a doctor has deemed the treatment to be medically necessary. So this is interesting. There's a few states already that force this mandate, basically. Yep. And I think there's a lot of implications that I hadn't really thought of until I started reading about this story. And I didn't know that Colorado was actually one of New York will be the 9th state actually to incorporate this type of law, I guess. So what were your first initial reactions to this statement?
Well, it was really interesting, some of the statements that were made throughout here and some of the logical assumptions. I thought one thing that was very interesting is that there's really been this push to try to, in 2012, the American Psychiatric Association tried to get rid of the phrase gender identity disorder.
Right.
And they changed it to gender dysphoria.
Exactly.
So there's this sense that this person is discontent with the gender that they're born into, with the biological sex that doesn't quite match what they feel.
Yes.
And so, but there's very much this idea that this is not a disorder. And yet the whole argument for this measure is the governor saying, well, if it's covered under mental health conditions.
Right.
So there's a little bit of an inconsistency here. That's what I first noticed. But I think one thing that we have to really keep in mind when we talk about this, you know, this gender reassignment surgery, it's a painful, expensive, difficult surgery. Yeah. So people who are going to choose to have this, there's a reason for it. They really are struggling and they're suffering. And I think we need to keep that in mind, that they deserve dignity and respect, and they really are suffering with you know, the difficulties that they have with this sex that they are born with.
Right, yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of what this gender identity disorder now called gender dysphoria, that's what it's all about, right? For those of you who don't understand out there or haven't heard of it, it seems kind of like a relatively new, or kind of recently there's been a lot made of it in the news. But it's where you don't identify with the sex that you were born with. So if you are a male, then you feel like you're actually you know, a female trapped in a male's body. And so these people have struggles with that, and they feel like they're trapped inside a different body than they should be, and so they go through things like just reassignment surgery, where they have surgery to change them to appear to be of the opposite sex and things like that, and you know, they feel that that's going to help them out you know, mentally with struggling with these types of things and being accepted by other people, et cetera, et cetera. So you're right. I think it is important to point out that they are going through some very troubling things, and so that is certainly one thing to consider. There's so many things that I could say about this. One of the things you know, is the verbiage, medically, you know, it needs to be medically necessary, right? And so there could be all kinds of discussion as to whether it's medically necessary. And then also, I think that one of the things that is potentially overlooked is that this could open the door for other things to become medically necessary, right? If a doctor, this could you know, raise insurance costs potentially, because other people could go on the principle that what's going on here and say, oh, well, if I can get my doctor to say that it's medically necessary, then it should be covered by insurance. So I think there's a lot of things that could be fallout as recourse to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not that these sex change operations were illegal before this. They were allowed. It's just that you had to pay for them yourself in some cases. And so what this is saying I have a right to change my sex, to go undergo this operation to try to change my sex, and I shouldn't have to pay for it. Somebody else, whether it's the taxpayer, the insurance company, some other people through their premiums, I have a right to a free sex change is the message being sent here.
Yeah, and not just a right, a health need, like a necessity.
And there was one lawyer who said, or the superintendent of financial services for New York, who said that this will further solidify the rights of a group that probably weren't always being treated as equal to everybody else. And so we have to realize that discrimination and hatred against individual people is wrong. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that the solution is not to try to go through these operations to try to change the sex. We need a better understanding of human dignity. That's what the real solution to this is.
Absolutely. It's a very difficult subject to comprehend and tackle.
Oh, absolutely. Definitely.
All right. For our next story, parents are up in arms in California because a Planned Parenthood took over teaching a sex education class. And what they taught these students as young as 13 years old was that it's okay to have sex and that they should choose what gender that they should be. So here's another gender story, right? There's a lot of things I can think about that are wrong with this, right? Whether you're a religious person or a Christian or not, having Planned Parenthood come in and teach this class, they obviously have an agenda and a certain thing. You know, they make what, $500 million a year, do $500 million a year in business, primarily, you know, making that money in promiscuity and abortions, right? So having them go in and teach the youth something that is going to directly benefit them potentially, you know, by what the material they're teaching them seems kind of contradictory.
Conflict of interest, perhaps.
Yeah, conflict of interest.
Yeah,
right.
and one of the big concerns here is that the parents weren't properly notified.
That's
so
a
they
huge
weren't
deal.
able to opt out properly if they didn't want their kids taught this. And some of these things, you know, you can choose your gender. So sort of saying, hey, you might think that you're a female and that you're a woman, but maybe you're not. Maybe you should rethink that. You should, you know, some of these ideas, and then telling them that they're ready to have sex at age 13. And so it's really raising questions about whether or not, who should be teaching kids sex ed? Should this be the schools? Should this be the parents? Who's going to be teaching this?
Yeah, exactly. Well, what do you think about it? Who do you think should teach it?
Well, you know, the church views the parents as the primary educators. We're the first people who educate our children. And especially with all of the problematic values out there in society today, it's very important to teach proper values from the time children are little. Now they aren't necessarily able to understand or ready for all the details of these types of things when they're young, but from the very beginning they need to understand some of these fundamental foundational principles. And some parents aren't doing that, and so then people say, oh, that's why the schools need to be teaching it. But the question is, whose morals, which values are going to be brought into it? Is it going to be Planned Parenthood values, secular values, Christian values? So I think it's hard to teach sex ed without some kind of value system, because you're either teaching that this is a form of recreation, or you're teaching that this is something sacred and a building block to new life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really, obviously, it's a very hotly debated subject and everything, and I don't know necessarily the right answer, but you know, I think if you're going to teach like some sort of sex education, that you should try to take all of those types of aspects out of it and just keep it very basic, because what Planned Parenthood did here was very focused on their agenda. You know, they had a genderbread man, you know, making, you know, kind of a play on words of the gingerbread man, right? So this genderbread man was like this picture and showed, you know, like the whole, you know, what sex is, what gender identity disorder basically is, and all kinds of different things, right? Like what you think about yourself. And it was just really disturbing, some of the things they said. I know you mentioned earlier that you know, parents weren't notified properly, and then I also heard that a couple of years ago that there was a time when a parent was notified, or parents were notified, but the bullet list of what was covered was not exactly, it was very, you know, there wasn't a whole, there was a lot more that was covered than what was revealed that they okayed.
And that's a huge problem.
And that's a huge problem too. But yeah, there's just a lot of problems. Some of the things that jumped out to me was this, you know, they had this thing called sex check. Are you ready for sex? And to me, I couldn't read it because all the printouts I could find were just tiny. But it sounded like they were almost like, okay, here's all the material that we're going to teach you that's going to be skewed towards, yes, you should be promiscuous. And then, okay, now that we've taught you all this information, here's a checklist, go ahead and answer these questions, which seem to be just a bunch of answers to the stuff that they just taught them. So it made it very easy for them to be like, yes, 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 oh, I'm ready for sex, you know? It seemed like it was very misleading, or leading them in a direction that they wanted them to go.
Absolutely. And even if they're not teaching this from a Christian standpoint, it seems odd that they're promoting this behavior, but just logically, from a health standpoint, you know, people are so cautious now to even allow sugary drinks or too much dessert or, you know, certain types of fatty foods, you know, snacks in schools because it's not good for kids. But we have to look, is it really good to tell kids that they can go out and be promiscuous? Look at the physical consequences, the emotional consequences, the spiritual and psychological consequences, teen pregnancy, STDs, the emotional attachments that are going with a sexual relationship. It seems like from a public health standpoint alone, you should not be encouraging this kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking, I know you mentioned food. Matt Walsh, he's a Catholic blogger. He had something kind of funny to say about the whole thing. He said, having this organization teach sex ed is like bringing in spokesmen from McDonald's to talk about proper nutrition. You know, it seems kind of, and so I thought that was pretty funny, and it kind of rang true, I think. And so yeah, just a really complicated situation. So we'll hope for the best. Hopefully the curriculum changes. So.
Absolutely, absolutely. Coming up after the break, fascinating data on the biology of sexual attraction.
Stay tuned. Hello and welcome back to Heroic Media. In case you're just joining us, I'm Patrick Cordova.
And I'm Michelle Bauman. In our next story, what is the role of biology in sexual attraction? And what are the consequences of messing with that biology? I had the opportunity to sit down recently with Vicki Thorne, the founder of Project Rachel, a ministry that works to help women who are suffering from abortion and its consequences.
Nice.
And she actually had a lot to say about this. So let's go ahead and take a look at what she has to say. Vicki, it's always great to have you on the show. Thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You have spent years looking at the science of sexual attraction, and you've come to the conclusion that there are some problems posed by the sexual revolution. So
yes,
to just
I have.
get us started, can you explain a little bit about what do you mean when you talk about the biochemistry of sexual attraction?
Well, you know, what I mean is that we exist in this society as though we're disembodied people, that it's all my intent, and it's like right here, and our bodies are sort of a bother sometimes. You know, we got to feed them and all that sort of thing. But the reality is we're made by God as embodied people. And we don't appreciate how awesomely we're made, especially when it comes to bonding and to the whole issue of sexual attraction and, you know, how two really become one. You know, we sort of dismiss some of what Scripture says as like, wow, that isn't really, you know, that was just kind of literature. It's not. And so as I've discovered more and more about how we've been lied to as women and men, that's what really led me to start looking even more and more at this. And the more I learned, the more annoyed I got, because if we'd known this, the sexual revolution might not have even happened the way it did, okay? So that's kind of the background to that whole piece of when we understand how we're made, it makes a difference in how we make decisions.
Absolutely. So when we talk about two people being attracted to each other, what's the science behind that?
Well, the first thing is that God gave us women the gift of being able, by scent, to recognize a male whose immune system is a complement to ours, okay? And if that's the person, now we gotta make sure he's still a nice man and all this sort of thing, but it's the first cut, all right? That's the possibility of fertility. But if I'm on chemical contraceptives, I am attracted to a totally different type of male. This is just the biological first cut, all right? And this is a male whose immune system is very much like mine or my father's or my brother's. This is a fertility challenge for starters. And if I go off the pill, so we meet when I'm on the pill, we marry, and then I go off, I don't find him sexually attractive anymore. It's a flat line. And that's a big issue because it destroys marriages. Okay, for men who are married to women who are chemically contracepting, they're not in the normal biological dance, which is when we women are ovulating, there's a scent factor here of something called pheromones, and they're scent molecules of affiliation. They tell us lots about family and other things, okay? But men don't perceive us to be ovulating when we're on the pill because it's flatlined, and so he's not in the dance because my ovulation changes his biochemistry. And think about this in terms of the possibility of being unfaithful. You know, my wife, you know, we've been on the pill for years, and I'm working with this sweet young thing who's not on the pill. And once a month, I'm very attracted to her. And I might succumb to the temptation to be unfaithful. And we don't know these things, you know. And we need to know them, and especially this business about picking the wrong partner, because so many of our young women are on the pill for health reasons. My body can't discriminate that. It is a systemic medication, all right? And it changes everything. And often when I do a talk on this, women will come up to me and say, you know, you just told me what happened in my first marriage.
Wow.
I didn't know. That's so sad. But there are so many pieces here in terms of how we women then carry cells of every child we ever conceive the rest of our lives. Men are changed biochemically by pregnancy. They go through hormonal changes.
Really?
Yes, a bunch, starting at 4 weeks after conception, which is before we're even sure we're pregnant. The scent, again, these pheromones change. His body goes into this father mode, okay? And so there's different changes at different times, but 60 to 90% of men will have symptoms of pregnancy with their partners. It's called kuvad. Primitive cultures know this. Our medical profession does not know this. And so he might be really sick and vomiting and nauseous and headaches and backaches and toothaches, and he kind of mumbles that he has food cravings and he's gained 6 pounds or so. But it's there. And then right before the baby comes, he undergoes hormonal changes. Testosterone drops, estrogen goes up, gets prolactin, which is the nursing hormone, and it lasts for 6 weeks. Very nice at this point. He's very helpful. So mothers should know this. Okay, you got 6 weeks of Starbucks and diapers at midnight, and then he'll say, you couldn't have called me and asked for diapers before I came home. But with every subsequent pregnancy, guess what? He gets more prolactin. It's as though nature and God recognize more responsibility. And so more help. All right?
Wow.
But there's so many pieces to this in terms of, you know, for us women, it takes 6 months of exposure to the sperm of our partner for our body to say, oh, that's my partner. Children we conceive then are recognized as our children, okay?
Wow.
There's just many, many things. And when we understand it, it's like this incredible aha moment, because it also explains to people who've struggled because they've had broken sexuality, what happened? You know, why am I such a mess? Why am I grieving? Why all these pieces that are there? And so it's important for us to understand this is the biology that underlies the theology of the body.
And it's great, and it's something that we don't talk about, and something we don't. I mean, I know never hear these things.
No, and we don't talk about them in biology class. You know, we certainly don't talk about them in sex education.
Right.
It certainly as it's presented in our public schools. We don't talk about this. And those teachers don't even know this stuff. It's all science. It's all out there. But nobody's really brought it all together and made sense out of it. And I find that young adults are just absolutely taken with this. I get into high schools, colleges. Older folks are too, because we never heard it either. But the young people will bring me to their campuses. They heard me in high school. They bring me to their campus. I'll say, I've heard your talk 4 or 5 times. I say, why? Because every time I hear something different. But I'm open to it. You know, the first time I'm blown away by the first set of information, then I know that part, and then I hear it again, and I'm like, oh. But it is what underlies marriage, okay, that two do become one. I'm carrying the DNA of my husband in those cells, okay? He's changed also in terms of the chemistry. It's so beautiful. And to see that we're so awesomely made by God. That we can walk in that truth.
Yeah, and so I mean the conclusion that this would lead me to draw is that maybe the Catholic Church's teaching on sexuality is not outdated. Maybe the Church's teaching is pro-woman and pro-man and just pro-human.
Absolutely, and you know we tend to get dismissed by the secular folks, but also by some of our people, because it's like, well, what, you know, those priests, they're celibates. What do they know? No, the reality is, I am convinced that Humanae Vitae was an act of the Holy Spirit, because all the people who were advising the Holy Father were saying, oh, contraception's fine, it's no problem, you know, it frees people, blah, 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 and in fact, it imprisons them.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here and to share all your knowledge. It's really incredible.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Wow, some good stuff. I like having Vicki on. I think she really brings a good, shines a new light on the whole talk about contraception, right?
Absolutely.
And the light that she's you know, sheds on it is very kind of neutral, I feel like. It's not like necessarily from a religious position. It's kind of logical, hey, this is the way things work.
Science-based.
Yeah, science-based. And it gives kind of science-based reasons why you might not want to take the contraceptive pill. And so, yeah, what stood out to you in your conversation with her?
Well, I mean, one thing that I I'm in shock at is how little people know about the consequences of the pill. It's this sort of immaculate thing. We can't touch it. It's so perfect. You know, you can't criticize it. It is like this holy grail. And so when some of this data does come out and we realize the devastating consequences that could have lifelong implications for yourself and your partner and your kids, I think it's really important that we listen to that and that we really take that into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just amazing how much happens biologically and with hormones and things like that you don't realize.
That you don't know,
and like you said, people just don't know. So it's great to have her sharing information like this so that you can kind of get informed about things. And it only it kind of makes everything else make sense, like regarding divorce rates and things like that. It's like, no wonder why, you know, people, you know, when the woman was taking the pill, she was not really herself, and they got married and then stopped taking the pill and then she's a different person.
It's one factor in a very complicated issue that we need to know about.
Yep. All right, stay tuned. We have one more story coming up after the break.
Welcome back to Heroic Media. In our final story, can you balance a career and motherhood? That's the question taken up by one woman who is currently finishing up her PhD and says that she really wants babies.
So no, you can't. You have to choose one or the other.
That's the message that's out there a lot of
Exactly.
time. And I think this is just such a fascinating discussion because this woman explains she actually thought that she had breast cancer. Turned out that she didn't, but it it
illuminated the fact that she wanted to have children.
Exactly. It just sort of made her realize that. But she's finishing up this PhD program and she's going, well, I spent all this time studying this and pursuing this and I love it and I want to do something with it, but I also really want kids. And so she just describes how she always grew up in a world thinking that it was either or. You were either going to be a mom or you're going to be a career woman. And she's just sort of pondering, can I do both? I want both. Can I do it? Am I going to be sacrificing one or the other? Is it going to be too hard? It's a very interesting question.
It is. And it's a question that crosses the minds of lots of 20 and 30-year-olds, right?
Absolutely.
And I mean, I'm not a woman, obviously, so it didn't cross my mind in that sense. But, you know, obviously there are stay-home fathers as well that have to ponder that question. But you know, I thought about it, and my wife and I talked about it as well, you know, because we both had career aspirations, and we didn't really actually say, okay, well, you're going to be the one that stays home from work, but, you know, being a mother and having to, you know, nurse your child and things like that, it's kind of like a given that you're, you know, the wife would be the one to stay home due to those reasons. But you know, I think every scenario you have to kind of work it out on itself, and like depending on what career you have might make you have different options as to how you want to balance your career and motherhood at the same time.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, this is a conversation that I've had and then I know my friends have had so many times. And the thing that's interesting is I think this is a very common question, but if we actually look at, there's some really interesting studies by the Pew Research Center, and what the Pew Research Center found was that for most American mothers, part-time work would be their ideal work situation. So they did this big study in 2012, and they found that out of, if cost were not involved, if women could do whatever they want, 47% said that they would choose part-time work. 32% said I want to work full-time, and 20% said I don't want to work at all. So by far the biggest number there is women who want to work part-time. There's a desire to balance this, but there's so much pressure on both sides that women don't know what to do. So on one side you have society saying, well, you're just wasting your life, you're wasting your time, you're wasting all your talents if you're a stay-at-home mom. What a waste. And then on the other hand, you have these feelings of guilt. Am I being selfish if I want to work? Am I being a good mother if I'm not with my kids? So there's a lot of different voices, and you're trying to balance all those is tricky.
It is tricky.
And you actually see then people, you know, some of the stories we've covered about freezing people's eggs in IVF, trying to delay motherhood through that. So, and those aren't the right solutions, but you see this desire, this longing in a woman's heart to maybe do both.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those statistics are really interesting because And I think we kind of grew up in society, you know, today's society says, yeah, if you are, you know, people equate success to having a career. And I think there's multiple facets, but that's one of them for why women want to have a career as well. Some mothers that I've talked to say, well, I can't be around my kids that long. Like, I need a little bit of a break or just a little bit of an outlet or something for me to get away and kind of get my mind on something and feel productive in a different way. And I think there's just different people that I've talked to, they have different thoughts on this, right? And of course, being a mother is a ridiculously difficult job. It's different than any other type of work you could ever do. And it has its own skill sets required and you will build patience and all sorts of things. But you know, I see there's value in everything, and I think you know, whatever path that you want to take, whatever share you want to have, 50-50, or you know, work part-time or full-time or whatever, you know, I see value in all those things. You know, I think that mothers need to remember that yes, they are mothers, so you know, they need to primarily be you know, focused on making sure they're raising their kids properly. But that's not to say that you can't also have a career. You just have to figure out how to make it work. So.
There's actually been some really interesting commentary from popes on this. Pope John the 23rd, at the start of the Second Vatican Council, wrote this letter, and he specifically talked about the need for women to get degrees.
Interesting.
And he talked about women's role in workplaces. And then John Paul II with the Feminine Genius, you know, he's talking about the unique contribution that women make to society, to the family, to the workplace, to society as a whole. And so there's not this idea that you shouldn't be in the workplace and your job is to just go find a husband and have as many kids as you can and stay home.
Right.
There is actually a view in the church that women can contribute in these different ways.
Absolutely.
It's just a matter of finding the balance.
Exactly.
And I think, as you mentioned, there's not necessarily one solution.
Right.
Maybe you have, you know, a child with disabilities who's going to require more attention. Maybe your financial situation is such that you need that extra income. You know, there's not one easy solution. I wish there were.
There isn't.
But I think we're starting to see workplaces that are willing to do flexible hours or work from home. So that's the good news, is that we're starting to come around to more flexible, family-friendly workplaces.
Absolutely. And just for the reasons that you mentioned, that's exactly what, you know, what my wife and I decided. She's a registered nurse. And so, you know, initially with our first two children, we said, okay, well, you know, once we had a couple of kids, we said, okay, well, you're going to go part-time now. So she's only working 2 days a week. And then now that we've had our third child, you know, we're like, okay, you know, you look at and you weigh the finances, you're like, okay, does it cost more for babysitting, or, you know, like, how's this going to work? And so you just have to figure it all out, and there is a way to do both.
And trust God.
Yep, absolutely. All right, that's it for this week on Heroic Media. Please join us next week for all the up-to-date news on the pro-life issues that matter to you. Please feel free to write to us with any comments, questions, or news tips at news@heroicmedia.org. And please check out our website at heroicmedianews.org, where you can read more stories like the ones we discussed on this episode. That's it for this time. Until next week, keep us in your prayers. God bless.